What month were you born in? You've probably answered that question 100 times, on forms, at the doctor's office, or when someone asks about your birthday. But have you ever paused and truly wondered, why was I born in that exact month? Could there be something hidden in the timing of my arrival on this earth? In the Bible, time is never random. It is divine. It is symbolic. It is appointed. It is prophetic. Every season, every month, carries a sacred meaning, a subtle vibration echoing from heaven. And if you've always thought your birth month was just a number on a calendar, then you may have overlooked one of the most profound spiritual codes about your identity. In this video, we'll unlock a door long forgotten. A door that reveals how your birth month carries clues about your destiny, your calling, and your soul's alignment in God's divine plan. Join me on this journey. And don't leave until you discover why you were born in that exact moment. To understand the hidden meaning behind your birth month, we must first step away from the modern calendar and look back in time, far back into the divine rhythm of God's calendar. In today's world, we live by the Gregorian calendar, January through December, a structure of convenience and control. But in Scripture, time wasn't simply measured. It was revealed. And it wasn't created by kings or astronomers, it was orchestrated by God Himself. In Genesis 1 verse 14, God declares, "Let there be lights in the expanse of the heavens, for signs and for seasons, and for days and years." This verse isn't just about the moon and stars, it's about how heaven speaks through time. The ancient Hebrew calendar followed the cycles of the moon, not the sun. It began not in January, but in spring, the month of Nisan, the time of Passover, rebirth, and new beginnings. Each biblical month carried its own spiritual tone, connected to Israel's festivals, battles, and blessings. You see, in biblical thought, when something happens is as important as what happens. God doesn't just do things sometime. He moves in appointed times, Moedim, which are divinely chosen windows of power and purpose. And here's the mystery. What if the moment you were born was one of those appointed times? Time in the Bible is not accidental. It's sacred. It speaks. And once you learn to listen to the season of your birth, you may start to remember who you really are. I once dreamed of a long corridor lined with 12 mysterious doors. None of them were numbered, yet each one gave off a different light, a sacred fragrance, a spiritual pull. As I walked through them, I understood the months of the year aren't just measurements of time. They are divine invitations, each month carrying a sacred message through the people born within it. January, the trailblazer in the dark. You were born in the season of Genesis, when God first said, "Let there be light." You were made to begin, to go first, to bring order where there is chaos. The world may not always understand you, you often arrive before your time. But remember, light never waits for approval before it shines. February, the soul that cleanses in silence. You come like the early rain, gentle, quiet, yet powerful enough to wash away what no one else can. You don't just feel, you feel deeply. Your tears are healing waters. People confess their hidden sins around you without knowing why. You were born to purify the heart, not by force, but by presence. March, the chainbreaker. You can't stand injustice. Your spirit burns when others are bound. You are the fire. The one who breaks open prison doors. The one who stands before Pharaoh without fear. But sometimes, it's lonely being a liberator. Remember, Moses walked alone before he led a nation to freedom. April, the healer who says nothing. You understand pain, your own and everyone else's. You don't need words to comfort. When you enter a room, people already begin to breathe again. You carry the spirit of the cross, not in bitterness, but in gentle compassion. You heal not by fixing, but by being broken and still choosing to love. May, the sacred architect. You were born with a blueprint in your soul. You build more than walls, you create holy space where others can encounter God. Like the builders of Solomon's temple, your hands move quietly, precisely. And when people step into what you've built, they feel peace, even if they don't know why. June, the voice on the mountain. You are the thunder on Mount Sinai. The truth teller. The revealer. The challenger. You were born to teach and awaken. To disturb the comfortable. Even if you feel alone, your voice echoes in heavenly places. You don't just speak, you deliver revelation. July, the covenant warrior. You're not loud, but when the battle comes, you rise without hesitation. You are David before Goliath. You protect, worship, and fight with your heart on fire. You may cry behind closed doors, but in public, you defend what is holy. You don't fight to win. You fight because you can't let injustice go unanswered. August, the gatherer of what's been left behind. You are like Ruth in the fields, gentle, faithful, patient. You know how to wait, how to pick up, how to believe when nothing is blooming. People find rest near you, even if they can't explain it. You were born to restore dignity, one soul at a time. September, the spiritual watchman. You were born to listen to the wind. While others sleep, you stay awake. You hear the shift in the atmosphere. You are not dramatic, you are discerning. When you speak, the world stirs. You are the one God trusts to ring the bell when danger is near. October, the purifier through fire. You walk through fire, not to destroy, but to refine. You were born to stand in the Holy of Holies, carrying burdens few can understand. You confront sin, not with anger, but with tears. You are the high priest with bells on your robe, every step a prayer, every breath a surrender. November, the hidden prophet. You're not meant for the spotlight. You are Elijah in the cave, waiting, listening, burning. You carry words meant for the future. Your silence is not absence, it's preparation. God hides those he most deeply trusts. And you are one of them. December, the bringer of hope. You were born in the season of fulfilled promise. You carry light, not loud or flashy, but steady and strong. You are the star that guides the lost. The whisper of joy in the longest night. You don't just survive the darkness, you birth light from it. 12 months. 12 doors. 12 divine callings. No month is ordinary. No birth is random. And maybe now, when someone asks, "When were you born?" you'll smile and think, "I was born for such a time as this." Esther 4 verse 14. Have you ever wondered? If God chose the exact moment to create the universe, if he appointed the precise hour for his Son to enter the world, if he parted the Red Sea at just the right time, then what if he also chose the exact moment for you to be born? In Greek, there are two words for time. Chronos, linear time, measured by minutes, hours, calendars. Kairos, sacred time, the divinely appointed moment when heaven touches earth. When Scripture says, "At the appointed time, Christ was born," that was Kairos. Not random. Not just another day. And I believe every soul is sent into the world in their own Kairos moment. Psalm 139 verse 16 says, All the days ordained for me were written in your book before one of them came to be. That means, before you were born, your time was already recorded. Not just your birthday, but the seasons you would enter, the trials you'd face, the people you'd meet, the doorways that would open to your soul. When you know what month you were born in, you're not just learning your birth date. You're discovering a sacred invitation to live aligned with your soul's spiritual season. Many people avoid the idea of destiny, fearing it's a prison. But with God, time doesn't confine you, it awakens you. Your birth month doesn't box you into a personality, it whispers of a mission your soul was always meant to fulfill. Were you born in a month marked by the cross? Maybe you've been called to love through pain. Were you born in the month of trumpets? You might be chosen to awaken souls that have fallen asleep. Some people go through life feeling like they don't quite belong. They're not broken. They're not wrong. They're just carrying a different spiritual season inside of them. If you were born in a time of preparation, holiness, or silence, then no wonder the noise of this world doesn't satisfy you. Maybe the restlessness isn't because you're lost, but because your soul remembers a calendar the world forgot. Time is not empty. It speaks. In God's hands, every second is filled with intention. When He breathed life into you at that exact moment, He wasn't just saying, live. He was declaring, live as someone born in this season, for what I have placed inside you. You won't need to ask, who am I, in confusion. Instead, you'll begin to ask, what is my birth month calling me to awaken within? You won't need others to define you. Because now, you'll begin to recognize. Whether you're in a season of planting or harvest. Whether you're being called to speak or to wait. Whether your soul was sent to tear down chains or to mend what's been broken. As we close this part of the journey, remember this. God never does anything by accident, including the moment you were born. And if you are ready to listen, your birth month may already be whispering. Now is the time to live in the spiritual season chosen for you. There are things we carry with us our whole lives, without ever realizing it. Like a background melody playing quietly behind our every step, your birth month may have been humming through your life long before you noticed it. No one teaches you how to listen for it. No one tells you that the season you were born into might carry a frequency, a spiritual imprint invisible to the eye. But if you pay close attention, you'll notice it. Perhaps you've always been drawn to a certain kind of person, a specific challenge, a recurring kind of sadness, or a strange, unshakable hope that lingers in the corners of your heart. We often think of time as a neutral shell, a framework we all pass through equally. But in the biblical world, time is an instrument in the hands of the Creator. It doesn't merely mark life, it shapes the soul. And when He placed you in that particular moment, maybe He was also inscribing a faint line on the map of your calling. Look at the people in the Bible. Most don't have their birth dates recorded, yet each of their journeys was rooted in a season, the season of calling, the season of hiding, the season of rebellion, the season of surrender. Each season arrived at its appointed hour, never early, never late. And like them, you too are moving through an invisible current, a divine rhythm you can sometimes feel, even if you can't quite name it. Maybe you believe you chose your own path. But look closer. You'll notice footsteps already laid out. Unplanned moments that arrived at just the right time. Doors that closed with uncanny timing, as if God were whispering, "Not yet. Wait for your season." And so you waited, sometimes in despair, sometimes in peace. But when your season came, everything began to fit, like a promise that had been waiting to unfold. Your birth month does not define you, but it leaves an echo, like the first voice your soul may have heard as it crossed into this world. It reminds you where you came from, why you're here, and what you were born to do. And when you begin to walk in spiritual maturity, you stop living just for today. You start living with the awareness that you carry a spiritual legacy, one that may leave an imprint on generations to come. You may not build a temple, but one word you speak, one act of kindness, one life you touch, can carry the tone of the season you were born in. You may carry the quiet light of December, or the trumpet call of September, or the hidden stillness of November. Whoever you are part of a greater symphony, where every soul plays a sacred note, in rhythm, in season, in time. And one day, when you look back, you may finally see it. I did not merely live through time, I was woven from it. I didn't just pass through the seasons, I left light behind in every one I walked through. We live in a loud generation, a world that knows more than ever, yet understands itself less than ever. In this flood of information, someone can know your birthday, your zodiac sign, even your blood type. But almost no one ever stops to ask, what were you born to become? No one whispers into your spirit at night. You are heaven's answer to a question the world hasn't even known how to ask. And so, your birth month, what was once a sacred signal carved into the door of your soul, has been reduced to a date for receiving discounts and birthday coupons. But what is sacred never disappears. It only waits for a heart willing to be still, to listen again. Because behind every month, there is still a voice. A promise. A thread leading you back to what you've forgotten. You were born on purpose, in a season chosen by God, carrying something the world desperately needs. Your birth month doesn't tell you who to imitate. It simply reminds you there is something inside you that no one else was ever meant to carry. Among the millions born on the same day, only you carry your season the way heaven intended. That's why this message still matters. Because in a world of noise, your birth month is a quiet invitation. Is your heart living in the season it was born for? If you were born in the season of light, you will stop chasing shadows. If you were born to sound the trumpet, you will stop hiding your voice. If you were born in the month of healing, you will start to forgive others and yourself. Your birth month is not just a box on a certificate. It is the gateway to spiritual awareness. And in a world that is losing its way, those who know their season will be the ones who help others come home. You may not remember where the calling first came from, but it is still there, quiet, patient, and gentle, like a knock in the middle of the night. And when you open the door, you won't just find a birth date. You'll find the reason you are here. Maybe all your life, you believed you were simply born in that month. That time just flows. That you're just one of millions, passing through, then fading away. But if what you've heard today is true, if your birth month isn't just a date, but a sign, a spiritual code written into your soul before your first breath, then that means you were chosen, you were called, and you are being remembered. Maybe you've never looked at your birth month through sacred eyes. Maybe you've brushed past the gentle signs God has been sending you through the seasons. But today, you can pause and ask your heart honestly, am I living as someone born for this season? You don't need to be perfect. You don't need to understand every symbol. You just need to open your heart. Begin again. And take one step at a time, walking in the rhythm of the season placed inside you. If this video made you feel called by name, if your heart beat faster when you heard your month described, that isn't random. That may be the Lord gently reminding you of the reason you're still here. And if you're ready, continue this journey. Search deeper. Listen closely. Uncover the season, the layers, the promises still asleep in your soul. Share this video with someone who's searching for who they are. Because maybe their birth month is whispering too. You were not born just to exist. You were born to awaken what is most sacred within you.